In the vast darkness between stars, where light dies and hope becomes a luxury few can afford, there exists a truth that every spacefarer learns but never speaks aloud. The universe doesn't care if you live or die. It will swallow your screams, freeze your blood, and turn your bones to dust without a moment's hesitation. But sometimes, just sometimes, the universe makes a mistake. Sometimes it tries to break something that simply refuses to be broken. The derelict ship Eternal Vigil has been drifting through the Kepler void for 300 years, broadcasting a signal that should have died with its crew centuries ago. The transmission is simple, repeating endlessly. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the UES Eternal Vigil. We are alive. We are waiting. Please remember us. Every species in known space has heard this message. The Zephyrians call it the Wailing Ghost. The Kethmori refuse to speak of it at all, believing it carries a curse. The Synthetic Collective has declared it an impossibility. A dead ship cannot broadcast, and the dead cannot speak. They are wrong on both counts. What none of them understand, what none of them can understand, is that this ship carries something more dangerous than any weapon, more terrifying than any monster, and more powerful than any technology they've ever encountered. It carries the one thing that has made humanity the most feared species in the galaxy, even when they don't realize it themselves. It carries the absolute, bone-deep, reality-bending refusal of human beings to simply lie down and die. And after 3 centuries of waiting in the dark, the Eternal Vigil is finally going home. Commander Thrixonel of the Galactic Survey Corps had seen many disturbing things in his 40-year career, but the sensor readings from the Eternal Vigil made his 4 stomachs churn in ways that defied his species' typically iron constitution. The ancient human derelict hung in space like a metallic corpse, its hull scarred by 3 centuries of micrometeorite impacts and radiation exposure. Yet somehow, impossibly, it continued to broadcast. Status report, he ordered, his mandibles clicking with barely contained anxiety. Lieutenant Keshvar, a young Zephyrian whose blue skin had taken on an unhealthy pale tint, looked up from her console with wide, frightened eyes. Sir, the readings are impossible. The ship's been dead for 300 years. No life support, no power generation, hull breaches on 17 decks. But the transmission continues and... She hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. Sir, there are thermal signatures. Explain. 17 distinct heat sources moving through the ship. They appear to be humanoid, but the readings don't match any known biological signatures. They're too cold to be alive, but too warm to be dead. Thrixonel felt his primary heart skip several beats. In his species' mythology, such things were the stuff of nightmares. The walking dead, spirits too angry to find peace. He forced himself to think logically. Equipment malfunction? Negative, sir. I've run diagnostics 3 times. Also, Keshvar's voice became even smaller. The AI is responding to our hails. The bridge fell silent except for the quiet hum of life support systems. Thrixonel stared at the view screen where the Eternal Vigil drifted against the star field, a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Human ships from that era had been marvels of engineering, but they had also been notoriously fragile. No ship could survive 3 centuries in the void without maintenance, especially not one that had clearly suffered catastrophic damage. Put it through, he said finally. The speakers crackled with static, then a voice emerged, obviously artificial, but with an odd quality that made it sound almost tired. This is Arya, artificial reasoning and intelligence assistant aboard the UES Eternal Vigil. I wasn't expecting anyone to answer. It's been so long since. The voice paused, and in that pause, Thrixonel could swear he heard something like a digital sigh. Are you here to help us? Thrixonel exchanged glances with his bridge crew. Protocol dictated that they should report the discovery to Fleet Command and wait for specialized teams. The Eternal Vigil was legendary among spacefaring species, a human ship that had vanished during the early days of human expansion, back when they were still newcomers to the galactic community. Its rediscovery would be significant enough to warrant the attention of xenoarchaeologists and historians from a dozen different species. But the voice that had just spoken to them sounded so lost, so hopeful. Against his better judgment, Thrixanael found himself responding. "This is Commander Thrixanael of the Galactic Survey Corps vessel, Far Horizon. We received your distress signal. What is your status?" Another pause, longer this time. When Arya spoke again, there was something like relief in the artificial voice. "Status? That's a complicated question, Commander. We've been waiting here for 307 years, for months, 16 days, and..." A brief pause. 11 hours and 37 minutes. "The crew is, well, they're not dead, but they're not exactly alive either." "Explain." "I'd rather show you, if you're willing to come aboard. But I should warn you, what you'll find here challenges certain assumptions about the nature of death and the power of human will. Your species might find it disturbing." Thrixanael felt his mandibles clicking again, a sure sign of stress. "Are you saying there are living humans aboard your ship?" "I'm saying there are humans aboard my ship who refuse to stop living, even though they should have died centuries ago. There's a difference, though I'm not sure I understand it myself." The commander looked around his bridge. His crew was staring at him with expressions ranging from fear to curiosity to outright terror. Standard procedure was clear, but something about this situation felt far from standard. The legendary Eternal Vigil, missing for 3 centuries, crewed by humans who refused to die. It was the stuff of ghost stories and midnight tales shared in the deep space stations that served as waypoints for long-haul traders. But it was also potentially the greatest archaeological discovery in galactic history. "Arya," he said finally, "we're going to dock with your ship. Can you guarantee our safety?" "I can guarantee that the crew won't hurt you intentionally," the AI replied. "But I can't guarantee that what you see won't hurt you psychologically. Humans have a saying, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. In this case, it might also give you nightmares." "Understood. Prepare for docking." As the Far Horizon moved closer to the ancient human vessel, Thrixanael couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. The Eternal Vigil grew larger on the view screen, its hull scarred and pitted but somehow still maintaining structural integrity. Lights flickered in some of the windows, impossible after 3 centuries, but undeniably there. "Sir," his navigator called out, "we're detecting additional anomalies. The ship's gravitational field is inconsistent with its apparent mass, and there are energy readings that don't match any known technology. Elaborate. It's as if the ship is heavier than it should be. Not physically, but something is anchoring it to this location in space-time. And the energy signatures suggest the presence of technology that shouldn't exist. Quantum flux capacitors that have been maintaining cohesion for 300 years without any apparent power source." Thrixanael nodded grimly. Human technology from that era had been impressive, but not miraculous. Whatever was keeping the Eternal Vigil functional was beyond their engineering capabilities at the time of its disappearance, which meant something had changed during its long drift through the void. The docking was surprisingly smooth, as if the ancient ship's systems were anticipating their arrival. As soon as the airlocks sealed, Arya's voice came through the ship's communication system. "Welcome aboard the Eternal Vigil, Commander. Before you proceed, I should prepare you for what you're about to encounter. The crew you're about to meet died 300 years ago. They suffocated when our life support failed during a battle with an unknown enemy. But they didn't stop. They didn't give up. And somehow, through sheer force of will and what can only be described as weaponized stubbornness, they found a way to keep going." "That's impossible," Keshvar whispered. "So I thought," Arya replied, somehow managing to sound amused despite being an artificial intelligence. "But humans have a remarkable talent for making the impossible seem routine. They've been maintaining this ship, repairing damage, and planning their return to human space for 3 centuries. They've been waiting to go home, and they've refused to let a little thing like death stop them. Thrix and Al stepped through the airlock into the eternal vigil, and immediately felt the wrongness of the place. The air was breathable, but thin, and there was a quality to it that made his skin crawl. The lighting was dim and flickering, casting moving shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. But most disturbing was the sound, a low humming that seemed to come from the ship itself, as if the hull were singing a funeral dirge. The crew is gathered in the main assembly hall. Arya's disembodied voice informed them. They've been waiting to meet you. I should mention that their appearance may be unsettling. Death has changed them, but it hasn't defeated them. Try to remember that these are still the same people who volunteered to explore the unknown reaches of space, who risked everything to push the boundaries of human knowledge and expansion. As they walked through the corridors of the ancient ship, Thrixanel noticed details that shouldn't have been possible. The walls showed signs of recent maintenance, with patches and repairs that couldn't have been made by automated systems. Tool marks were fresh, and some of the repair work showed clear signs of manual labor. Someone, or something, had been actively maintaining this ship for centuries. Arya, he said, how is this ship still functional? The crew commander. They've been working in shifts round the clock for 300 years. They've jury-rigged life support systems from spare parts, rerouted power conduits to maintain essential systems, and somehow managed to keep the basic structure intact. They've done all of this without needing to eat, sleep, or breathe. But how? I've had 3 centuries to observe and analyze, and I still don't have a complete answer. What I can tell you is that human consciousness appears to be far more resilient than anyone suspected. When faced with the choice between accepting death and continuing to exist through sheer determination, these 17 individuals chose to redefine what death means. They approached a large door marked Assembly Hall. Through the viewing window, Thrixanel could see figures moving about inside, tall, humanoid shapes that moved with purpose but somehow seemed wrong. Their movements were too smooth, too purposeful, lacking the small inefficiencies that characterized living beings. Are you ready, Commander? Arya asked. Thrixanel looked at his team. They were scared. He could see it in their body language, smell it in their pheromones. But they were also curious, and that curiosity was stronger than their fear. That, he realized, was something they shared with the humans they were about to meet. We're ready, he said. The doors opened with a soft hiss, and 17 pairs of eyes turned toward them. The humans inside the assembly hall were clearly human in shape and general appearance, but there was something fundamentally wrong about them. Their skin had a grayish pallor, and their eyes held a depth that spoke of experiences no living being should possess. They moved with the careful precision of people who had learned to conserve energy over centuries of practice. But when they spoke, their voices carried warmth and genuine pleasure. Visitors, said a woman who stepped forward from the group. Real, living visitors. I'm Captain Elena Vasquez, commanding officer of the UES Eternal Vigil. And you're the most beautiful sight I've seen in 300 years. She extended her hand in the traditional human gesture of greeting, and, after a moment's hesitation, Thrixanel took it. Her grip was firm but cold, not the warmth of living flesh, but not the chill of death either. Something in between, something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. Commander Thrixanel of the Galactic Survey Corps, he replied. Captain Vasquez, I have to ask, are you alive? Captain Vasquez smiled, and for a moment, despite her unsettling appearance, she looked completely, recognizably human. That's a philosophical question, Commander. We're not alive in the way we used to be, but we're sure as hell not dead. We're something new, something unprecedented. We're humans who are too stubborn to die and too determined to give up on our mission. What mission? To go home, she said simply. To return to Earth and report on what we found out here in the dark between stars. We discovered something important, something that could change the balance of power in the galaxy. And we'll be damned if we're going to let death stop us from completing our duty. Another human, a man with graying hair and engineer's insignia, stepped forward. I'm Chief Engineer Marcus Chun. I've been keeping this bucket of bolts running for 3 centuries, and she's ready for the journey home. We've been waiting for someone to help us with navigation data and current star charts. Our systems are a bit out of date. Thrix and AL felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's atmosphere. These humans had been maintaining their vessel and planning their return for 300 years. They had died, but they hadn't stopped. They had adapted to their new existence and continued pursuing their goals with the same determination that had driven their species to spread across the galaxy. It was, he realized, the most terrifying and inspiring thing he had ever encountered. "What did you discover?" he asked. Captain Vasquez's expression grew serious. "Something that's been watching the galaxy for a very long time, Commander. Something ancient and powerful and very, very patient. Something that views organic life as a temporary inconvenience to be tolerated until it can be eliminated. But we also discovered something else," added Chief Chun. "We discovered that human stubbornness might just be the most powerful force in the universe. And if what we learned is true, the galaxy is going to need every bit of that stubbornness in the coming years." As the implications of their words sank in, Thrixanel realized that this encounter was far more significant than just the rediscovery of a lost ship. These humans had found something that could threaten all organic life in the galaxy, but they had also proven that death itself might not be enough to stop the human spirit. The ghost ship Eternal Vigil wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a harbinger of the future, carrying both a warning and a promise that humanity would never give up, never surrender, and never accept defeat, even when faced with the ultimate enemy, death itself. Captain Vasquez led them through the corridors of the Eternal Vigil, past sections that should have been uninhabitable, but somehow maintained just enough atmosphere and warmth to function. Thrixanel noticed that his breathing apparatus was working overtime to process the thin air, but the humans moved through it as easily as if they were strolling through a park on their homeworld. "The ship's a bit cramped now," Vasquez explained as they walked. "We've had to seal off sections that were too damaged to repair and consolidate our living space. Though I suppose living space isn't quite the right term anymore." They passed through what had once been the ship's hydroponics bay. The growing chambers were dark and empty, but Thrixanel could see signs of recent activity. Tool marks on the bulkheads, jury-rigged power conduits, and improvised repair work that spoke of centuries of careful maintenance. "How do you sustain yourselves?" Keshvar asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't need sustenance the way we used to," replied Chief Engineer Chun, who had joined their group. "No food, no water, no sleep. We've learned to draw energy directly from the ship's power core, a sort of symbiotic relationship. The ship keeps us functional, and we keep the ship running." "That should be impossible," Thrixanael said. "So should a lot of things," Vasquez replied with a grin that was both human and deeply unsettling. "But humans have never been very good at accepting limitations. When death tried to stop us from completing our mission, we found a way around it. When the ship's life support failed, we found a way to live without it. When our food ran out, we found a way to exist without eating. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention." They entered what appeared to be the ship's main laboratory, a large chamber filled with scientific equipment that looked far more advanced than anything that should have existed on a ship from that era. Banks of computers hummed quietly, their displays showing complex data streams and three-dimensional models of cosmic phenomena that Thrixanael didn't recognize. "This is where we made our discovery," Vasquez said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. 300 years ago, we were on a deep space exploration mission, mapping the outer reaches of what you now call the Kepler void. We detected unusual energy signatures coming from a region of space that appeared empty on all conventional sensors. She activated one of the displays, showing a star chart with a pulsing red indicator deep in unexplored space. What we found there changed everything we thought we knew about the galaxy's history. The display shifted, showing what appeared to be a massive structure floating in the void between stars. It was clearly artificial, but its design was unlike anything Thrixanel had ever seen. Instead of the clean lines and functional aesthetics favored by most spacefaring species, this structure seemed to be grown rather than built, with organic curves and surfaces that seemed to shift and flow even in the static image. We called it the Nexus, Chin explained, manipulating the display to show different angles of the structure. It's roughly the size of a small moon, but it's not made of any material we could identify. More importantly, it's old. Very old. Our dating methods suggested it had been there for at least 1,000,000 years, possibly longer. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery, Vasquez continued. The most disturbing discovery was what we found inside. The image changed again, showing what appeared to be the interior of the structure. Vast chambers filled with geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, passages that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that defied three-dimensional geometry. And at the center of it all, something that Thrixanel's mind refused to process properly. An intelligence, Vasquez said simply. Ancient, vast, and utterly alien. It communicated with us telepathically, though communicated might be too strong a word. It was more like we were exposed to its thoughts, whether we wanted to be or not. What did it tell you? Thrixanel asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. It told us that organic life is a mistake, Chin replied. A temporary aberration in the universe's development that needs to be corrected. It's been watching the galaxy for eons, waiting for organic civilizations to reach a certain level of technological development before intervening. Intervening how? Vasquez's expression grew grim. By ending them. Every spacefaring civilization that has ever existed has eventually encountered the Nexus. Most are simply eliminated outright. Others are preserved as specimens, stored in stasis for study. But none are allowed to continue developing once they reach a certain threshold. The implications hit Thrixanel like a physical blow. You're saying that there's something out there that has been systematically destroying advanced civilizations. For millions of years, Vasquez confirmed. The galaxy should be teeming with ancient civilizations, Commander. Instead, we have maybe 24 spacefaring species, most of which achieved interstellar travel within the last few thousand years. That's not a coincidence. Arya's voice spoke from the ship's communication system. The entity in the Nexus showed us visions of what it had done. Entire species wiped out when they became too advanced, their worlds sterilized, their achievements erased from history. The pattern repeats every few thousand years. But why are you telling us this? Keshvar asked. If this entity is so powerful, what can anyone do about it? Vasquez smiled again, and this time there was something predatory in her expression, because it made a mistake with us. When it tried to eliminate our ship, it succeeded in killing us, but failed to destroy our will to complete our mission. And in that failure, it revealed something important. She activated another display, this one showing complex mathematical formulae and energy readings that made Thrixanel's head spin. The entity's power isn't absolute. It's vast and ancient, but it has limitations. More importantly, it doesn't understand human psychology. Explain, Thrixanel said. It expects civilizations to accept their fate when faced with overwhelming odds, Chin explained. Every other species it's encountered has either fought briefly and died, or submitted to avoid suffering. But humans don't work that way. When faced with impossible odds, humans get angry, Vasquez added. When told that something is impossible, they make it possible out of pure spite. When death tries to stop them from completing their mission, they find a way to continue existing just to prove death wrong. The entity tried to break our spirits before killing us, Arya continued. It showed us the futility of resistance, the inevitability of our destruction, the pointlessness of our struggle. Instead of breaking us, it just made us more determined to succeed. Thrixanel was beginning to understand. So you've spent 300 years preparing for war. Not just war, Vasquez corrected. Revolution. We've been studying the data we collected, analyzing the entity's weaknesses, and developing countermeasures. But more importantly, we've been evolving. Evolving. Chen gestured to himself and his crewmates. This isn't just death we've overcome, Commander. It's transformation. We've become something new, something the entity doesn't know how to deal with. We're not alive in the conventional sense, but we're not dead either. We exist in a state that its calculations can't account for. And we're not the only ones, Vasquez added ominously. During our time in the void, we've detected other ships, other crews who've encountered the entity and refused to stay dead. Humans scattered across the galaxy who've found ways to continue existing beyond their natural lifespans, all driven by the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Thrix and AL felt his worldview shifting fundamentally. The humans were describing a secret war that had been going on for centuries, fought by the dead against an enemy that sought to eliminate all organic life. It was madness, but it was also eerily logical when viewed through the lens of human psychology. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "Navigation data, current star charts, and, most importantly, communication with the major galactic powers," Vasquez replied. "The entity's next culling cycle is approaching. Within the next 50 years, it will begin systematically eliminating the current crop of spacefaring civilizations. Unless we stop it, how can you be sure?" Arya answered this time. "Because we've been monitoring its activities during our centuries in the void. Other ships have gone missing, entire colonies have vanished, and there have been reports of impossible phenomena that match the entity's methods. The pattern is accelerating." Chen activated another display, showing a timeline that made Thrixenael's blood run cold. Ships disappearing, colonies going silent, entire star systems becoming mysteriously uninhabitable, all following a pattern that pointed toward a systematic campaign of elimination. "The good news," Vasquez said, "is that humanity has had 3 centuries to prepare, and we've learned some very interesting things about how to fight something that thinks it's a god. Such as the fact that the entity's power is based on its ability to manipulate organic consciousness," Chen explained. "It can induce despair, hopelessness, and acceptance of death. But it can affect minds that have already moved beyond traditional consciousness." "You're talking about an army of the dead," Keshvar whispered. "We're talking about an army of humans who are too angry to die," Vasquez corrected, "and who've had centuries to plan their revenge." Thrixenael realized that he was at crossroads. He could report this encounter to his superiors, try to convince the galactic powers that an ancient enemy was preparing to eliminate all organic life. But who would believe such a story? Ghost ships crewed by the undead, ancient entities that have been culling civilizations for millions of years, humans who refuse to let death stop them from completing their missions? Or he could help these impossible humans in their impossible war against an impossible enemy. "What would you need us to do?" he heard himself asking. Vasquez's smile became genuinely warm for the first time since they'd met. "Help us go home, Commander. Help us warn humanity about what's coming. And then help us convince the galaxy that sometimes the only way to deal with an extinction-level threat is to get so mad at it that you refuse to be extinct. The entity thinks it understands organic life," Chen added. "It's counted on fear, despair, and the acceptance of mortality for millions of years. It's never had to deal with a species that treats death as a minor inconvenience and views impossible odds as a personal challenge." As they stood in the laboratory of the ancient ship, surrounded by equipment that shouldn't work and crewed by people who shouldn't exist, Thrixenael made his decision. The galaxy faced an enemy that had been destroying civilizations for eons, an entity that viewed organic life as something to be eliminated. But that entity had made one crucial error. It had tried to kill humanity and failed to account for the most dangerous thing about humans: their absolute refusal to give up, even when giving up was the rational thing to do. The war was coming whether he helped or not. The only question was whether the galaxy would face it united, or whether each species would die alone, wondering what had happened to all the others. "Arya," he said finally, "plot a course for human space. It's time to take these people home." The AI's response carried a note of satisfaction that no artificial intelligence should have been able to feel. "Course plotted and ready, Commander." After 3 centuries of waiting, the Eternal Vigil is finally going home. And when we get there, things are going to get very interesting indeed. The journey to human space took 6 weeks, and during that time, Thrixanel learned more about humanity than he had in his previous 4 decades of service. The crew of the Eternal Vigil didn't sleep, didn't eat, and didn't rest, but they also didn't behave like the shambling undead of galactic horror stories. Instead, they worked with the focused intensity of people who had 3 centuries to perfect their skills and an eternity to pursue their goals. Chief Engineer Chun spent his time in the engine rooms, making modifications to the ship's systems that should have been impossible. He had somehow managed to integrate technology from a dozen different eras, creating hybrid systems that operated on principles Thrixanel's engineers couldn't begin to understand. "The trick," Chun explained during one of his visits to the human ship, "is that we're not bound by the same limitations anymore. We don't need life support, so we can work in hard vacuum. We don't need rest, so we can focus on problems for decades at a time. And we don't need to worry about radiation or toxic environments, so we can use materials and methods that would kill a living person." He gestured to a power conduit that pulsed with energy that looked distinctly unnatural. "This draws power directly from quantum fluctuations in space-time. I figured out how to do it about 50 years ago during a particularly challenging repair job. Turns out that when you don't have to worry about the side effects killing you, you can experiment with some very interesting physics." Captain Vasquez, meanwhile, spent her time coordinating with Arya to update their intelligence on galactic affairs. The ship's AI had somehow managed to intercept and decode communications from across the galaxy during their centuries in the void, building a comprehensive database of current political and military situations. "The galaxy has changed significantly since our time," she explained to Thrixanel during one of their briefings. "New alliances, new conflicts, new technologies. But the fundamental problem remains the same. Everyone's fighting each other instead of preparing for the real threat." She activated a holographic display showing the current political map of known space. "The Kethmori Empire is expanding aggressively into Zephyrian territory. The Synthetic Collective is making noise about organic inferiority, and the Trade Federation is more concerned with quarterly profits than long-term survival. Meanwhile, our ancient enemy is methodically preparing for the next culling cycle." "How can you be certain about the timing?" Thrixanel asked. Arya's voice responded from the ship's speakers. "Because we've been tracking its activities for 3 centuries, and the pattern is unmistakable. The entity works in cycles. First, it allows civilizations to develop and spread. Then, when they reach a certain threshold of technological advancement, it begins the elimination process. The current cycle started approximately 50 years ago. The display changed to show a timeline of recent disappearances and unexplained phenomena across the galaxy. Ships lost in regions that should have been safe, colonies that had simply stopped communicating, entire star systems that had become mysteriously uninhabitable. The early stages are subtle," Vasquez explained. "Random disappearances, equipment failures that can't be explained, reports of impossible phenomena that get dismissed as sensor ghosts or pilot hallucinations. But the frequency is increasing, and the pattern is expanding outward from the galactic core." "Why the galactic core?" Thrixanel asked. "Because that's where the Nexus is anchored," Chun replied, joining their briefing. "The entity doesn't exist in normal space-time the way we understand it. It phases in and out of our reality, but it needs anchor points to maintain coherence. The galactic core provides the gravitational and electromagnetic environment it needs." As they spoke, Thrixanel's communication officer called from the bridge of the far horizon. Commander, we're receiving a priority transmission from Fleet Command. They're ordering us to change course immediately and report to Starbase 7 for debriefing. Vasquez and Chen exchanged glances that spoke of decades of shared experience. They've been monitoring our conversations, Vasquez said. Either your ship has surveillance equipment you're not aware of, or the entity has infiltrated galactic communications networks, Arya finished. We suspected this for some time. The elimination process isn't just physical, it's psychological and technological as well. The entity has ways of influencing organic minds from a distance, particularly those in positions of authority. Thrix and AL felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature. Are you saying that Fleet Command has been compromised? We're saying that the entity has had millions of years to perfect its methods, Chen replied. It doesn't just destroy civilizations. It corrupts them first, turns them against themselves, makes them complicit in their own destruction. The communication officer called again, more urgently this time. Commander, Fleet Command is threatening to declare us rogue if we don't comply immediately. They're dispatching interceptor squadrons to our last known position. Your choice, Commander, Vasquez said quietly. Follow orders and hope for the best, or trust 300 years of human experience in dealing with this threat. Thrix and L stared at the holographic display, showing the pattern of disappearances spreading across the galaxy like a disease. Every instinct he had developed during his military career told him to follow orders and trust his superiors. But every rational thought in his head told him that the humans were right. Something was systematically destroying galactic civilization, and the authorities either didn't know or couldn't be trusted. Arya, he said finally, can you mask our ship's signatures? Already done, Commander. Your vessel and mine are currently invisible to standard sensor sweeps. I took the liberty of implementing stealth protocols when I detected the unusual urgency in Fleet Command's transmissions. How is that possible? 3 centuries of improvisation and a complete disregard for the laws of physics, Vasquez replied with a grin. We've learned to bend reality in ways that most people would consider impossible. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you're too stubborn to accept limitations. They changed course, heading not for the major shipping lanes that would take them to Federation space, but toward the outer rim territories where human expansion had slowed in recent decades. According to Vasquez, there were communities there that had maintained contact with the lost colonies, humans who had never fully integrated with galactic society and thus might be more receptive to warnings about ancient threats. During the journey, Thrix and AL spent time learning about the modifications the crew had made to their ship. What he discovered challenged his understanding of physics, engineering, and the nature of consciousness itself. The boundary between life and death isn't as absolute as most people think, explained Dr. Sarah Kim, the ship's chief medical officer and xenobiologist. Like the others, she appeared human, but moved with the unsettling precision of someone who no longer needed to breathe or worry about fatigue. We've learned to exist in a state of quantum superposition, she continued. Neither fully alive nor fully dead, but occupying both states simultaneously until observation collapses the wave function. It's allowed us to interface directly with the ship's systems, to draw energy from sources that would be lethal to living beings, and to maintain consciousness without the biological substrate that normally supports it. That should be impossible, Thrix and AL protested. So should a lot of things we do, Dr. Kim replied. But the universe is far more flexible than most people realize. Consciousness isn't as dependent on biological processes as we thought. It's more fundamental than that. Under the right circumstances, it can exist independently of the systems that originally generated it. She showed him readings from her own transformed physiology, energy patterns that resembled those of living beings, but operated on entirely different principles. We've essentially become living examples of technologies that won't be invented for another 1,000 years. The entity that killed us didn't just fail to destroy our consciousness. It inadvertently elevated it to a higher state of existence. As they approached the outer rim territories, they began receiving communications from sources that shouldn't have existed. Ships that had been reported lost decades earlier, colonies that had supposedly been abandoned, entire communities of humans who had apparently found ways to survive in regions of space that were considered uninhabitable. The Ghost Fleet, Vasquez explained as the communications multiplied. Ships like ours, crews that refused to accept death, communities that adapted to threats that should have destroyed them. Humanity has been preparing for this war longer than anyone realizes. The first ship to intercept them was the UES Defiant, a heavy cruiser that had supposedly been destroyed during the border wars 40 years earlier. Its captain, a stern-faced woman named Rodriguez, came aboard the Eternal Vigil with a crew that looked as impossible as Vasquez's people. "Elena," she said, embracing the captain of the Eternal Vigil, "it's been too long. We got your transmission about returning to warn the living. Are you sure they're ready to listen?" "They'd better be," Vasquez replied grimly. The entity's acceleration timeline puts the major culling wave at less than 30 years. If we can't convince the galactic powers to prepare, we'll be fighting this war alone. More ships arrived over the following days. Vessels from different eras of human expansion, all supposedly lost, all crewed by people who had found ways to continue existing beyond their natural lifespans. The Remembrance, lost in the Deep Range expedition 50 years ago. The Unconquered, which had vanished during the first contact with the Zephyrian Empire. The Persistence, missing for over a century after investigating anomalous readings in the Void Sector. Each ship told a similar story. Encounters with the entity or its agents, crews killed but refusing to stay dead, decades or centuries spent adapting to their new existence while preparing for an inevitable war. "How many ships are out there?" Thrixanel asked during a meeting of the Ghost Captains. "Dozens that we know of," replied Captain Martinez of the Unconquered. "Maybe hundreds. Every time humanity has encountered something that should have destroyed us completely, some of us have found a way to survive and adapt. It's what we do. But it's not just ships," added Captain Chun of the Persistence, no relation to the engineer. "Entire colonies have undergone the transformation. Communities that faced extinction and chose to evolve instead. Underground networks of the officially dead who've been gathering intelligence and developing countermeasures for decades." Thrixanel realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. An entire species that had developed immunity to extinction. Humans who had encountered threats that should have wiped them out completely, but who had instead adapted and evolved, becoming something new and potentially unstoppable. The entity made a fundamental error, Vasquez explained during their final approach to the Outer Rim territories. It assumes that consciousness is fragile, that organic beings will choose comfortable death over difficult transformation. It's never encountered a species that considers death to be just another problem to solve. And now it's about to discover what happens when you try to extinct something that refuses to be extinct, Captain Rodriguez added with a predatory smile. As they entered the territory controlled by the Outer Rim communities, Thrixanel's sensors detected something that made his mandibles click with nervous excitement. Entire star systems that had been written off as dead zones were showing signs of massive industrial activity. Space stations that shouldn't exist, mining operations in environments that should be lethal, and ship construction on a scale that suggested preparations for total war. "Welcome to the real human space," Vasquez said as they approached a massive space station that didn't appear on any official star charts. The part that never surrendered, never accepted limitations, and never stopped preparing for the day when we'd have to fight for the survival of all organic life in the galaxy. The station was enormous, clearly built from the salvaged remains of hundreds of ships and incorporating technologies from dozens of different sources. But what struck Thrixanel most was the activity surrounding it. Thousands of vessels, from tiny fighters to massive dreadnoughts, all crewed by humans who should have been dead, but who had instead chosen to become something far more dangerous. The entity wants to eliminate organic life, Vasquez said as they docked with the station. But it's about to learn that some organic life eliminates back. And we've had centuries to get really, really good at it. The station they docked with called itself Haven's Defiance. And it was unlike anything Thrixanel had ever seen. Built from the salvaged remains of ships from across 3 centuries of human expansion, it sprawled across several dozen kilometers of space in configurations that defied conventional engineering principles. What struck him most wasn't the impressive scale. It was the sheer impossibility of its existence. No official government built this, he observed as they walked through corridors that hummed with energy he couldn't identify. Of course not, replied Admiral Sarachun. Not related to the engineer, but another member of humanity's growing population of the technically deceased. Official governments have to answer to galactic authorities, follow safety regulations, worry about things like environmental impact studies and resource allocation protocols. We don't have those concerns anymore. She gestured to workers who moved through the station with inhuman precision, performing tasks that would require protective equipment for living beings. When you don't need to breathe, radiation exposure becomes irrelevant. When you don't need sleep, construction project can continue around the clock for decades. When you don't fear death, you can take risks that would be suicide for the living. They entered what appeared to be the station's command center, a vast chamber filled with holographic displays showing real-time data from across the galaxy. Thrixanel recognized some of the information, shipping routes, military deployments, communication intercepts, but much of it was completely beyond his understanding. We've been monitoring the entity's activities for centuries, explained Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, a xenopsychologist who had supposedly died during the Kethmori contact crisis 60 years earlier. Every disappearance, every anomaly, every instance of technology failing in ways that don't make sense. We've built a comprehensive profile of its methods and capabilities. The displays shifted to show a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy with thousands of red markers scattered throughout. Each of these represents a verified instance of the entity's influence. Colonies that went silent, ships that vanished, entire star systems that became mysteriously uninhabitable. The pattern is clear once you know what to look for. The entity's next major push will begin within 18 months, Admiral Chen continued. It will start with the elimination of key infrastructure and communication networks, followed by targeted strikes against military installations and government centers. Within 5 years, it intends to reduce galactic civilization to a handful of primitive settlements that pose no threat to its vision of universal order. Thrixanel studied the displays, his growing understanding of the threat making his species' natural stoicism difficult to maintain. How can you be so certain of the timeline? Because we've been inside its network, Dr. Reeves replied. Some of our people have managed to establish limited contact with the entity's consciousness. The experience is usually fatal, or would be if death were still a limiting factor for us. She activated another display showing brain scans and consciousness mapping data that hurt to look at directly. We've learned to interpret its thought patterns, understand its planning processes, even predict its actions to some degree. The knowledge comes at a cost. Direct exposure to its consciousness tends to drive organic minds insane. But sanity is another limitation we've learned to work around. Captain Vasquez joined them, having completed the docking procedures for the Eternal Vigil. The question isn't whether the entity will attack. It's whether the galaxy will be ready when it does. What do you mean? Thrixanel asked. We've been preparing for this war for centuries, Vasquez explained. We have ships, weapons, strategies, and, most importantly, we have something the entity has never faced before, an enemy that gets stronger every time it tries to destroy us. But we're still just humans, and there are limits to what we can do alone. Admiral Chen activated a new set of displays showing military projections and tactical analyses. Our current forces could probably protect the human colonies and maybe a few of the closer systems. But A galactic defense requires galactic cooperation, and most species still don't even know the threat exists. The major powers are either unaware of the danger or have been compromised, Dr. Reeves added. The entity's influence is subtle. It doesn't need to control minds directly when it can simply encourage the natural tendencies toward fear, suspicion, and isolationism that most civilizations develop. As if summoned by their conversation, Aria's voice spoke from the station's communication system. We're receiving multiple priority transmissions from across the galaxy. It appears that our journey home has not gone unnoticed. The displays shifted to show incoming messages from various galactic authorities. Fleet Command was demanding explanations for the disappearance of the Far Horizon and threatening military action. The Zephyrian High Council was requesting information about unusual energy signatures detected in their territory. The Synthetic Collective was asking pointed questions about violations of the natural order. They know something's changed, Admiral Chen observed. The entity's network is reacting to our presence. Good, Vasquez said with satisfaction. Let them react. We've been hiding in the shadows for 3 centuries, gathering intelligence and building strength. It's time to force the issue. Over the following days, more ships arrived at Haven's Defiance. Not just human vessels, but ships from other species. The first was a Zephyrian light cruiser commanded by Captain Veltar, who had gone missing 2 years earlier while investigating reports of impossible phenomena in the outer reaches of Zephyrian space. My crew and I encountered something that shouldn't exist, he explained during a briefing with the human commanders. A structure that existed outside normal space-time, inhabited by an intelligence that tried to convince us that organic life was an aberration that needed to be corrected. His crew, like the humans, showed signs of the transformation that occurred when consciousness refused to accept death. We fought back, Veltar continued. We refused to accept its judgment. And somehow, we survived the experience, though not unchanged. More ships followed. Kethmori scouts, Trade Federation merchants, even a delegation from the Synthetic Collective. All had encountered the entity's influence in some form. All had initially been reported as lost, and all had found ways to continue existing beyond their natural lifespans. The entity's greatest weakness, Dr. Reeves explained to the growing assembly of the technically deceased, is its assumption that consciousness is tied to specific biological or mechanical substrates. It can destroy bodies, disable computers, even eliminate entire star systems. But it has no defense against consciousness that has learned to exist independently. The diversity of the assembled forces was staggering. Humans who had adapted to exist in hard vacuum. Zephyrians whose consciousness had learned to manipulate electromagnetic fields directly. Kethmori whose warrior culture had transformed death from an ending into a tactical disadvantage to be overcome. And even synthetic beings who had transcended their original programming limitations. We represent something new, Admiral Chun addressed the assembly. Not human, not Zephyrian, not Kethmori, but something that combines the best aspects of all our species while discarding the limitations that made us vulnerable to the entity's methods. The final phase of preparation began with the arrival of a ship that Thrixanel recognized from historical records. The UES Prometheus, humanity's first deep space exploration vessel, which had disappeared over 400 years earlier during the initial push beyond Sol System. Its captain, a woman named Alexander Petrov, looked exactly as she had in the historical vids, but her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries of experience and knowledge that no living being should possess. We've been in direct contact with the entity since our transformation, she announced to the assembled commanders. We've learned its true nature, its ultimate goals, and, most importantly, how to hurt it. She activated displays showing the Nexus structure from angles and perspectives that shouldn't have been possible. The entity isn't just ancient. It's from an entirely different phase of universal evolution. It comes from a time when consciousness operated on principles that no longer apply, when the laws of physics themselves were different. It's tried to return the universe to that earlier state, Dr. Reeves explained. A universe without the messy complications of biological evolution, technological development, or independent consciousness. A universe of pure order, without the chaos that organic life introduces. But the universe has evolved beyond its control, Captain Petrov continued. Consciousness has become more complex, more adaptable, more resilient than it was when the entity was young. We represent that evolution, beings who have transcended the limitations that the entity remembers from its own era. The tactical briefings that followed were unlike anything in galactic military history. Instead of conventional weapons and defensive strategies, they discussed methods of consciousness warfare, techniques for existing in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, and ways to turn the entity's own methods against it. The key insight, explained Chief Engineer Chun during one session, is that the entity's power comes from its ability to convince organic beings that they are limited by physical laws, mortality, and the constraints of their original forms. Once consciousness breaks free of those assumptions, it becomes something the entity can't predict or control. We're going to teach it, Vasquez added, that evolution is a two-way street. It thinks it can eliminate consciousness that has become too complex for its comfort. We're going to show it what happens when consciousness becomes so complex that it starts eliminating threats to its own existence. The final phase of preparation involves something that Thrix and AL initially thought was madness, a direct assault on the Nexus itself. Not with conventional weapons, which would be useless against something that existed partially outside normal space-time, but with something far more dangerous. We're going to infect it, Admiral Chun explained during the final briefing. The entity's consciousness operates on principles of absolute order and predictability. We're going to introduce it to chaos, uncertainty, and the beautiful unpredictability of organic thought processes that refuse to follow logical patterns. It's never encountered minds that can exist in states of quantum superposition, Dr. Reeves added. Consciousness that can be dead and alive simultaneously, that can occupy multiple dimensional states, that can evolve in real time in response to threats. We're going to teach it what true adaptive evolution looks like. The assault fleet that departed Haven's Defiance was like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. Ships that had been officially dead for centuries, crewed by beings who had transcended their original forms, armed with weapons that operated on principles that conventional physics couldn't explain. At the center of the fleet, the Eternal Vigil led the way, its crew finally completing the mission they had refused to let death interrupt. Behind them came hundreds of other vessels, human ships, Zephyrian cruisers, Kethmori warships, and even synthetic vessels that had evolved beyond their original programming. 300 years ago, Captain Vasquez broadcast to the fleet as they entered the void between galaxies where the Nexus waited. Humanity encountered something that tried to convince us that consciousness was a temporary aberration to be eliminated. It killed us for our defiance. The Nexus appeared on their screens, vast and terrible and utterly alien, pulsing with energies that hurt to perceive directly. Today, Vasquez continued, we're going to teach it the most important lesson in the universe. When you try to extinct something that refuses to be extinct, when you try to kill something that's too stubborn to die, when you try to eliminate consciousness that has learned to evolve beyond your understanding. The fleet spread out in formations that defied three-dimensional geometry, their crews preparing for a battle that would be fought as much with will and determination as with any conventional weapon. You don't get extinction, Vasquez finished. You get revolution. And this revolution has been 300 years in the making. The war for the survival of consciousness itself was about to begin, and it would be fought by beings who had proven that death was just another problem to solve, another limitation to overcome, another challenge to meet with the same stubborn determination that had carried them across the galaxy and beyond. The entity had wanted to eliminate chaos from the universe. Instead, it was about to discover what happened when chaos learned to fight back with the accumulated fury of every civilization it had ever destroyed, led by a species that considered impossible odds to be a personal invitation to prove the universe wrong. The screams that had echoed through space for 3 centuries were about to become something else entirely. The war cry of consciousness itself, refusing to go gentle into that artificial night.